And this is why I say that liberalism is a disease. Right, y'all? It's white people's fault. It's all my white brethren in here. It is all your fault, right? It is white people's fault that blacks have poor health outcomes. I don't know if you knew it, but the white boogeyman is at it again. Yes, we can't catch a break because the structural racism of white folks, it's causing us to have poor health. Listen, before I present this retarded content, and provide my commentary on the stir-fried foolishness, marinated and dumb, I just want to say that if you are a Christian and you watch and you listen to the foolishness that is propagated on MSNBC, like, I am begging you to just open up your Bible, and I demand that you turn off the stupid tube. Like, I can't. Like, you will not be able to preserve your brain cells for future use if you watch and you listen to the garbage that they put on network television every single day. You guys, biblical discernment is needed in all areas of life, not just as it relates to spiritual matters, right? Like, you literally need to employ the help of the Holy Spirit, even as it relates to the news content that you take in, because y'all, everywhere you turn, wicked people spend a great deal of time lying to you to push a wicked agenda so that you just abandon objective truth in favor of the foolishness that they want you to believe. So I came across a segment on MSNBC that just left me with my jaw just wide open. I was just like, this is really happening. Y'all, these people, they want you to believe that whiteness is a sin that just affects every area of your life. And so in this segment, I'm going to share it. There's a black female physician who argues that only 20% of our health outcomes can be attributed to what we personally do. But no, the remaining 80%, that's someone else's fault. Yes, that's the argument. Now, to be honest, I could spend an entire show on this topic because while I'm not a doctor, I did spend a considerable amount of time as a holistic health coach. So I have a lot to say about this. But let me play it first, and then I'm going to come back and engage with it. So
we did seek out to understand the relationship between structural racism and health because we know that ethnic and racial minorities have much worse health than others in the United States, including higher rates of chronic conditions, acute conditions, and earlier death rates. So what we did was study over 260,000 North Carolinians who lived in 150 neighborhoods in Durham County, North Carolina. And what we did was measure structural racism in their neighborhoods and measure their health. And we defined structural racism as factors which work together to create discriminatory conditions in neighborhoods that disadvantaged ethnic and racial minorities. We looked at 16 factors, which included the neighborhood racial composition, education and employment rates in a community, income and poverty rates in the community, criminal justice, housing, voter participation, and even the amount of green space and tree cover in a neighborhood. And what we found, in short, was that if there was more structural racism in a neighborhood, the health of the neighborhood was worse. So if you had higher structural racism, you and your neighbors were more likely to have higher rates of kidney disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure. These are three major conditions that we're fighting against in the United States and major conditions that we know that ethnic and racial minorities suffer worse outcomes from.
Yeah. Oh. It's going to be a while before I recover from this one. So before I played the clip, I was about to tell you guys that, to be honest, I really could spend an entire show on this topic, because when I had my health coaching practice, the main reason why I no longer do that anymore is because I got tired of trying to help people who didn't really want to be helped, right? Like I got burnt out and tired of working with clients who they preferred to blame everything else on why they were experiencing the health outcomes that they were experiencing, instead of just taking ownership of the fact that they, and they alone, were the ones responsible for how they used a knife and a fork to dig themselves into an early grave. And it was just really that simple. And y'all, if y'all know me in real life, some of y'all have met me and been around me long enough to know I will help you and I will be there for you. And I am loyal to a fault. But if after I've repeatedly told you what to do, right, I've given you all the tools, all the resources for you to just achieve the results that you want, and you still don't listen, I'm going to just walk away and wash my hands clean and just leave you to your foolishness of your own devices, because I can't. I'm like, especially the older I get, I do not have the patience of Job, right? Like I have the patience of April, who is still being sanctified, but not the patience of Job. But I wanted to play that clip because the first individual who spoke, she's an intellectual, right? But I'm going to play this next clip because it is a member of the medical profession. So it's a member of the medical profession. The lady you just heard from, she is someone from academia, and they are claiming that structural racism is the blame for the vast majority of the poor health outcomes of Black people. And I just sat puzzled. Because in the clip that I just played, I would venture to say that woman made a lot of assumptions. And I have so many questions, right? Like, for one, the first thing I want to know, I was like, well, what is structural racism? Just me being naive, little black and slow girl. I don't know. She said that they measured structural racism and measured the health of the participants in this study. And I sat there I was like, okay, well, I need more information because I need to know what the heck is structural racism as she defines it. So what I did was I went and I was like, okay, let me try to find or discover a definition of structural racism. And I found that the claims that systemic and structural racism, they are forms of racism that are pervasively and deeply embedded in systems, laws, written or unwritten policies, and entrenched practices and beliefs that produce, condone, and perpetuate widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color. So with that framework in mind, I'm struggling because I'm like, okay, well, where are these laws and policies or practices that perpetuate the widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color? Just a question. I'm just wondering. Now I'm familiar with Jim Crow laws, right? But can someone point out to me the laws or the policies that exist today that are perpetuating widespread unfair treatment and oppression of people of color? Like, is there one in the chat? Anyone? Can you point to? No. Okay. I mean, I'll wait for a little bit. Like, if you guys can help me out with that. I don't know, but in that clip, the academic, she made some assumptions that have yet to be proven, in the sense that she indicates that where this structural racism is present, you have higher incidences of kidney disease and degenerative disease. So I'm going to go ahead and play the rest of it. I just wanted to point that out. She made a connection that where this is happening, there is actually the kidney disease and degenerative disease is just flourishing. But let's play it some more.
We did seek out to understand the relationship between structural racism and health because we know that ethnic and racial minorities have much worse health than others in the United States, including higher rates of chronic conditions, acute conditions, and earlier death rates. So what we did was study over 260,000 North Carolinians who lived in 150 neighborhoods in Durham County, North Carolina. And what we did was measure structural racism in their neighborhoods and measure their health. And we defined structural racism as factors which work together to create discriminatory conditions in neighborhoods that disadvantaged ethnic and racial minorities. We looked at 16 factors, which included the neighborhood racial composition, education and employment rates in the community, income and poverty rates in the community, criminal justice, housing, voter participation, and even the amount of green space and tree cover in the neighborhood. And what we found, in short, was that if there was more structural racism in a neighborhood, the health of the neighborhood was worse. So if you had higher structural racism, you and your neighbors were more likely to have higher rates of kidney disease, diabetes, and high blood pressure. These are three major conditions that we're fighting against in the United States and major conditions that we know that ethnic and racial minorities suffer worse outcomes from. We chose Durham because sorry. You asked me about why we chose Durham, and I just wanted to say Durham, North Carolina has a huge range of living conditions, all the way from severe poverty to extreme wealth. And so provided an opportunity for us to look at this for the first time, and then to take several different types of data that were available and from the community, public records on income and poverty, criminal justice, but then also compare those to health records that had been made publicly available by the county public health so that we could look at neighborhood health.
Dr. Blackstock.
Okay. Woo, that was a lot. She said a whole lot. I love how these academics put the word salad together to sound really intellectual. But then when you actually sit and analyze what they're saying, you be like, ooh, lady, you sound real dumb right now. But okay, first of all, if anybody in the live chat, if you guys grew up in the hood, just raise your hand. Ain't no reason to be ashamed. Like, I grew up in the hood. You know, if you don't want to raise your hand, you don't have to. But I'm just curious. If you grew up in what would be considered the hood, just, you know, I'm raising my hand in the affirmative on that. No shame about who I am, where I come from. I'm from the hood. Now, I grew up in the hood. Like, I'm from New York City. Y'all, I'm from one of the crappiest boroughs in New York City, okay? Like, when you put, you know, Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, well, Staten Island may got us beat, but the Bronx, like, it's gutter, okay? I'm gonna just say that. It's crappy. It is what it is. I love it, but it's who I am. It made me who I am, but it's pretty crappy. So yes, I am qualified to speak on this, right? I grew up around lots of concrete, broken or missing basketball courts. I can count how many times we actually got a net, and then probably within a week, somebody, you know, Mike and them, which is being how Mike is, cut it, and then we're like, oh, we had a net, but now it's gone. Oh, well, you know, you're used to not having a net anyway. But grew up there, broken, missing basketball courts, pissy mattresses, lots of pimps and prostitutes, and crack. Yes, lots of crack. Lots of crack. Like, I could identify crack vials probably before, you know, I knew how to do long division. But we had one grocery store that was maybe, in relationship to where I lived, maybe 3 miles away. And it wasn't the best, right? It was your typical hood grocery store. But you know what they had? They had food in there. They had food and they had vegetables. Then they also, yes, they had pig feet and hog maws, but you know what? Nobody made me eat any of those things. Like my mama just did not cook like that. Okay, we didn't do the pig feet. I mean, even at the bodega, like, so the bodega is the corner store. The bodega had pickled pig feet in a jar right there on the corner. They had the pickles that was basting in sodium nitrate and nitrites and all kinds of preservatives. Like, we had a plethora of candy and cookies, a hero. Like, I could have a whole meal. I could have a hero with like ham and cheese with extra mayo, lettuce, tomato, little bit of oil and vinegar. Those were the best. Oh, I don't even know where they get that bread from, but it was so good. A Welch's grape, and a bag of some Wise chips. I could get all of that for less than $5. Okay? But the conversation here that nobody wants to have, I am arguing that it's twofold. One, y'all, people don't want to talk about the fact that we're digging our graves with a knife and fork, and it has zero to do with systemic racism, right? Like we don't need more government. We actually need less government and more personal responsibility. Something that you're going to hear the actual physician, the one who went to undergrad and med school and did a residency. Like, this woman is credentialed. She actually indicates that only 20% of your health outcomes have to do with what you do, which is crazy to me. But when I listen to the foolishness that's coming out of these people's mouths, like, y'all, I can't help but to ask so many questions, right? So I'm going to go ahead and play it. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to get engaged with it.
We did seek out to understand the relationship between structural racism and health because we know that ethnic and racial minorities have much worse health than others in the United States, including higher rates of chronic conditions, acute conditions, and earlier death rates. So what we did was study over 260,000 North Carolinians who lived in 150 neighborhoods in Durham County, North Carolina. And what we did was measure structural racism in their neighborhoods and measure their health. And we defined structural racism as factors which work together to create discriminatory conditions in neighborhoods that disadvantaged ethnic and racial minorities. We looked at 16 factors, which included the neighborhood racial composition, education and employment rates in the community, income and poverty rates in the community, criminal justice, housing, voter participation, and even the amount of green space and tree cover in the neighborhood.
Y'all, did I just rewind that back to the beginning and she just played the same thing she just said? I'm sorry if I did that. Y'all, it's getting late. Let me play it and go to the part that I want to engage with. So hold on.
And what we found first time.
Discrimination through interconnected systems, including housing, education, and unemployment. Can you clarify for our audience how the prevalence of certain factors like inadequate housing and schools and even the quality of nearby medical facilities, they are all indicators of structural racism, which can then negatively affect these actual health outcomes?
Yeah, thank you so much, Charles, for having me. An honor to be on with Dr. Boulware. Thank you for this study. It's so important to informing what policymakers need to do. I think so often we think about health as individual choices that patients make. And instead, we really need to understand how practices and policies, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, current day systemic racism impacts the health of our communities. So when we have people who have housing insecurity, who live in food deserts, who live in communities where there's not enough green space for them to walk around or to work out, where they're not able to find gainful employment, where they're not able to have quality education, we know that racism is a key driver of what we call the social determinants of health. And what we see in terms of health inequities and health disparities are the downstream outcomes of those. And so I think it's so important for us to connect the dots. The dots that need to be connected are that, individuals are only responsible for about 20% of what makes them healthy. The other 80% are these systemic factors that Dr. Boulware and her colleagues studied in this very, very important research that needs to inform how, communities and resources are given. So, for example, we have seen a chronic disinvestment in Black communities and communities of color, which have led to these poor health outcomes. So the results that, Dr. Boulware's study showed really needs to inform policies that impact health on a more holistic level. So it's not just about what medications a physician prescribes or a health professional prescribes. It's about what is the prescription for making a community healthier? What will allow it to have higher quality education, better job opportunities, more green space? All of that is critically important. And I'm so glad that we are now discussing those factors instead of what happens inside of an exam room or a clinic room, because we know what happens at the community level has the highest and most significant impact on the health of our communities. And our communities deserve that. Because of discriminatory housing policies and other racist practices, we are seeing what we're seeing now in terms of these high burdens of chronic disease in our communities, diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease. Essentially, it's killing us. And so I think that there's an obligation for policymakers at the local, state, federal levels to partner with community organizations. I think also for healthcare institutions, there's an obligation for them as well to really look at what strategies do we need to employ to mitigate how the impact of the legacy of systemic racism, past and present, and what's happening even current day in our communities.
Y'all, this woman is too cute and too articulate to be this stupid. I'm sorry. I know that wasn't really gracious and, okay, I'm going to reel it in because okay. So she says that 20% of our health outcomes are the individual's responsibility or fault. Okay. And I listened to that and I was like, well, isn't that convenient? Right? Like, when you put it that way, it sure does feel better knowing that I can just blame white people for my double chin. Right? Like this one right here, like somehow, some way, somewhere, a white person, way back from slavery times and even up until today, they are responsible for my food choices because it's directly tied to where I live and the kind of job or career that I have and the kind of education I receive. And even she mentioned housing. So I'm like, wow, housing makes me fat and diabetic. Like, who knew that our predecessors who lived in log cabins with no heat and dirt floors, who were way thinner than I could ever be, and ate, just whatever they could get their hands on. They didn't have these health outcomes and disparities, but somehow the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and she said the divestments and the green space, we can't forget the green space, jobs and housing. That's what's making us fat and diabetic, needing dialysis. So let's examine some of her preposterous claims, right? My question, I guess, what does slavery have to do with people who choose fast food over buying some chicken and cooking it at home? Right? Like, is the Popeyes, is there like a slave master at the drive-thru at the Popeyes that cracks the whip and say, Negro, you best to order this 2-piece with this dry biscuit? Like, is that what's happening? Is there someone that's at the grocery store that bars our entry that says you cannot buy this pack of chicken and cook it at home? Like, what systemic policy is in place that prevents me from going to school, graduating from school, and then taking that education and either exploring a trade or use it to get a job that offers me health benefits. You don't even need to have like some fancy pants health plan to be healthy in this country. Like, let's not get too deep into the details, but you can be on food stamps and WIC and eat healthy, right? Like, the government, with all of its flaws, allows you to use EBT to purchase real food, not processed foods, but like real foods, like whole foods, not the store, but actual whole foods, where you can use food ingredients to actually make a meal. And no white person has ever barred anyone access to do this. Now, I know the argument is that, well, if you're poor and you live in a food desert and therefore you can't eat healthy. I'm sorry, I still struggle to believe that, because grocery stores, or supermarkets as they were originally called, you guys, that's a modern construct. All of us at one point lived in some sort of food desert, right? Because Walmart, that's a modern construct. The idea that you could just walk into a store and there was all this food on the shelves and you just had your pick of whatever you wanted, that is a modern construct. Before there were these giant grocery stores, you had the meat market or the butcher, and you had a produce stand, and that was it. Like, that's all you had. Or you had a chicken, a hog, and your own cow in your backyard, and that was it. Like, my great-grandmother was poor, and she fed all 7 of her grandchildren, my mother included, plus some random neighborhood strangers and folks that was traveling through from Virginia up to New York for a better life. Like, no white person was stopping her or forcing her to, stopping her or forcing her to make a pot of beans or a pot of vegetables and throwing some fat back or some neck bones in the pot. Like, I like a good pot of beans with some neck bones. But my grandmother, once she hit her 60s and was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, she chose on her own recognizance, the same poor woman, to lose weight and to make better food choices so that the disease didn't progress and cause her to be put on insulin. Like, back then, before disease management became a thing and before HMOs were possible, doctors actually did not want to put you on medication. Like, they spent time with you. They would sit down with you and be like, listen, all right, Sister Henry, we're gonna have to get a manage on this sugar, because you got the sugar now. And what happens is, when you don't manage this sugar, eventually we may have to start cutting some stuff. It's gonna start with a toe, and then next thing you know, that foot gotta go, and then we gonna get you up to the shin, and next thing you know, you walking around. No, there's no walk. You're gonna be rolling around with a nub. They didn't want to put you on medication. The pharmaceutical industry wasn't this conglomerate that it is now. They actually counseled people on it, and this is back when, before our food supply was just completely jacked up. These were people who was on like the food share program, where you got like that greasy, hard as a block peanut butter and that government cheese. Like, listen. I am tired of these Black intellectuals who sit in their ivory tower offices and then they come on television and spew this garbage. Like, this is garbage. They talk about Black people as if we are these infantile victims that simply can't catch a break, right? Like, we can't keep ourselves alive and healthy because, racism is the reason. But here's the truth. Americans, not just Black people, Americans, we are having disproportionate health outcomes in relation to the rest of the world because we live in a country of indulgence and overabundance. Yes, even with all this inflation, the whole country is fat. Look around, like the planes. We used to have these little narrow planes. Now they're making the planes wider. They're making the seats on buses wider. Caskets, talk to anybody in the funeral industry. They be like, we ain't never made caskets this wide before. I mean, the whole country's fat. If you are obese, it is obvious that you have access to food. Now, it's lower quality food based on the fact that you're choosing what to put in your mouth. But in fact, if you're obese, it's because you eat too much darn food. Yes, the quality of your food is a factor. But what we are going to do, I want to know when we're going to have a conversation about the health outcomes of Americans, right? Americans, all of us. Because to single out Black folks, yes, we can have a conversation about what's going on with the health outcomes of Black folks, and I got loads of opinions on that. But it is trash for these people to sit and try to isolate and say the health outcomes of Black folks is because of structural racism, right? Like, our health outcomes are trash because we've allowed the government to control everything. And we've allowed the government to tell us how to nourish ourselves, right? Like, when it comes to the health outcomes of Black people specifically, the way they frame this is that because you've had this, because you experience, whether real or perceived discrimination, which I still need them to prove to me that it is happening on this widespread scale, they're saying that you're just destined to be sick, right? If anyone, I want to know who's going to address the elephant in the room, that metabolic syndrome, which is what I call the trifecta of disease and death in the Black community, is preventable. Like, metabolic syndrome is that's your obesity, your high blood pressure, and your diabetes. All three of those together falls under the classification of metabolic syndrome. And these diseases, y'all, it is pure diet and lifestyle diseases. So this means that you're not just unlucky, right? It's not because you poor and the white man at the bank didn't give you a home loan because your credit was bad, right? Like, it's not because you don't live near a park with enough green space that you just so happen now you can't exercise. Like, there are people, the most impoverished of those in this country have a smartphone and they have access to YouTube. You can YouTube a fitness channel and just be like, okay, I'm going to stand in place and exercise. You don't need green space for that. Green space? What? Like, it is not because the police pulled you over and because you read that red light, then now you got an anxiety disorder that causes you to overeat, which led to your obesity and high blood pressure. Like, that's not happening. That's not how it happened, right? How about we just hold ourselves accountable, right? All of this is a lack of personal responsibility and accountability because these people, they want you to point to something out there as the reason why we are fat, sick, and nearly dead. Everybody knows the soda is bad for you, but let me guess. It was the white girl at the checkout counter who scanned the soda and twisted your arm and made you buy it instead of water. Because, you know, she represents a structure that's just so embedded into the racist fabric of this country that you had no other choice than to buy the soda and to drink it. I am really struggling here to make the connections that these intellectuals, put that in air quotes, are making, because I'm not like the brightest crayon in the box. And I know, y'all, there are times when I admit, when it comes to some things, I'm just a little slow. You know, I just be like, I didn't get it. Like, sometimes things don't click for me right away. But this right here, nah, I'm not seeing it. But I can guarantee you that these people, there are people who hear this mess and they eat it up and they nod and agree and say, yes, slavery is why I'm overweight. Yup. I have hypertension and diabetes, and I'm about to get placed on dialysis right now because of racism. That's it. I knew that it wasn't me. I knew it was something wrong all along. They did the study, and so therefore that's it. If MSNBC don't go somewhere with this foolishness, how are our children supposed to function and view themselves when this is the trash that's being promoted? Instead of telling them, she talked about everything else, but wanted to say it's just 20% of what you do, right? Just 20%. The 80% has to do, I guess for me, I wrote down that I was struggling to see the connection, because I'm not that smart, right? So that's probably going to be why I don't see it. The connection between the economics, the racism, and the health. They talk about themselves as if there are no poor white people that have metabolic syndrome. They talk about it like there's not people of means that are white that don't have high blood pressure, diabetes, and are obese. Like the green space and the housing. Did you ever mention, they never spend time to say, you know what, we're just going to teach people how to nourish themselves. You know why they're not going to do that? Because they already know that it is easier to sell this foolishness and to keep people enraged and to keep people angry and perpetually grieved at those that don't look like them, instead of them saying, you know what? I know I inhaled that whole bag of Ruffles potato chips, but it was so much easier for me to blame Becky. It's Becky's fault. It is. It's Becky's fault. I'm over it. I don't really have anything else to say about that. I just wanted to share that story with y'all and to help you to, as a believer, to be able to discern dumb when you hear it. The way they talk about the sin of partiality known as racism, as if is this woe is me. And the poor black folks, like they can't even control their own health. Because the white man, he's controlling that too. No.